All right, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on our latest episode of The Buzz with the Berkeley Center for Law and Business. My name is Anjali Patel, and I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Law and Business at Berkeley Law. And, we're gathered here for a very important topic. The title of the webinar is When CEOs Become Targets, and it is alluding to recent headlines and we're gathered here to unpack and learn together about what this moment is for the world of business. But before we start unpacking and learning, I did want to make a couple of announcements. Throughout this webinar, we'll be sending a link in the chat for you to collect CLE credit. Please be sure to use that link and sign up before the end of the webinar. This is how we keep track on our end of when and who should get credit. We'll also share a link to our website. We host these webinars for very timely discussions that are happening in the corporate world. So if you'd like to stay updated, subscribe and visit our website. And then finally, if you have any questions that you may not have had a chance to ask or anything occurs to you later, you can absolutely send us a note at bclb@law.berkeley.edu. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen and I will just kick it off with our panelists here today. Perhaps we can do a quick round of introductions, and I'm going to just start with whoever I see first on my screen. Alan, would you mind giving yourself an introduction?
Sure. Real quickly, Alan Denenberg. I'm a corporate partner at Davis Polk. I've been at Davis Polk for about 25 years out here in California doing capital markets and M&A and general corporate work.
Thank you. What about you, Seth?
Hi, I'm Seth Jaffe, coming to you from Mill Valley, California, and I teach at Berkeley Law a course called Being General Counsel, also an executive ed course as part of General Counsel University. Before that, I was the General Counsel and Chief Legal Officer of Levi Strauss & Co., and before that, Williams-Sonoma.
Well, thank you for that. And then Stavros would love to hear from you.
Hi everyone, I'm Stavros Gardinis. I'm a professor at Berkeley Law School. I teach business associations and securities regulation. And my research is on corporate governance, social issues, and financial regulation.
Well, thanks for joining us. We put this webinar together pretty last minute, and we're just very thankful that the three of you could jump on and really help us talk about something that's very difficult. And I'm alluding to the recent murder of the CEO of United Health. And it took the business world and honestly all of the US kind of by surprise as to both what happened, but also the reception. And so, none of us are really experts on something like this. It is difficult. I know many in the audience may feel that this is a very difficult topic, and you are very much encouraged to take the time you need if this is not the kind of conversation you need to be a part of. But I did want to just collect, your initial reactions and thoughts before we really get into the nitty-gritty. And perhaps, Stavros, you can kick us off. My question, but also an open-ended thought is, the murder of anyone is just too tragic. And at the same time, we're seeing kind of an unusual public response. How should we think about this kind of generally?
Yes, so as you said, Anjali, the murder of anyone is an event that kind of tends to haunt public view and public opinion. And it's, one of these crimes that people almost universally agree that it's bad for a very long time. But what we see in the reaction to this particular murder. So first, what we see that this murder was had a symbolic character from the very beginning, that the person who committed this murder um, didn't have some sort of personal animus against the CEO, but it was his position as the CEO was what made him the target. So it was very clear that this was a murder that had some sort of an agenda or a manifesto behind it. And that's why one of the charges that are brought is a terrorism charge. So, and so we have this kind of really bad, it's very rare that CEOs have become targets of actions like that before. But the reaction, the public's reaction is even more perplexing because this guy ends up becoming a little bit of a folk hero of sorts. There are people who, especially in the rarefied world of social media, there are reactions that are I wouldn't say, well, not positive, at least to the murder, but at least understanding of his motivations, of Luigi Mangioni's motivations. And that sparks a conversation about healthcare in the US more generally. And not only that, but then we have an additional step where this conversation about healthcare kind of becomes a broader conversation about corporate America and some sort of general reluctance or reticence against corporate power that hadn't been registered in the public in this way before. So it's become an issue where many people felt that the whole soul of corporate America was kind of up for debate.
What about you, Alan? Any reactions to that?
Yeah, certainly agree with everything Stavros had to say. I would say a couple of things that I struggle with, or at least one in particular that I struggle with in this event and the dialogue that follows, is that the violence associated, so the crime that was committed, the extreme violence, you almost hesitate to then turn that into a conversation about broader social issues, whether that be in healthcare or whether that be in the corporate world generally. I'm not saying we shouldn't have that conversation, and we'll have some of that today, particularly on the corporate side. But you almost hesitate to do it because, or I do, because I don't want a murder to be an impetus, but I want to disconnect those things. It's a conversation that should be had regardless. It's not a conversation that should in any way be linked to, God forbid, another murder or any violence, whether it be against physical property or worse yet, obviously, human violence against humans. The other thing that strikes me about all of this, that's sort of another overlay, that just kind of thread that weaves in here, is a broader societal one in the US where violence as a means, and that, again, it could be violence against property, it could be horrible like this, violence against other people, has become a little bit less, I don't want to say it's acceptable. It's not acceptable, but the leaders around the country, political leaders, others, have not expressed the displeasure for violence and have made light of it in some cases. I'm not talking about even in this case, just generally, in a way that I've never seen in the United States before. And I think when you throw that on top of all of the things that Stavros mentioned, it just adds to, it's sort of like we've got the tinder there for this sort of thing, and then a reaction that none of us, I certainly didn't expect, but in hindsight, I see where it's coming from.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's a lot that the two of you have already mentioned. Seth, I'd love to hear from you as well.
So I agree with what's been said. I would say my take on it is a couple of things. One, I feel that Alan's absolutely right in saying that it would be a mistake to overreact on a number of levels. Broadly, you don't want to encourage, of course, the use of violence to bring about social change when there are so many other ways that we haven't taken advantage of and that are available to us. And similarly, even from a security perspective, where I have a lot of strong thoughts, I think companies that overreact to this are making a mistake. It's a horrible tragedy, and I think that acknowledging that is different than saying we're going to change everything and actually now start talking to our customers. The other thing, though, that it reminds us is that there's an increasing lack of empathy in public discourse in the United States. It's not just on social media, but it's worse on social media. And anything that we can do, all of us, to start building a little more empathy and a little more dialogue would be, I think, the most important thing that we can start doing now, so that we can try to attack some of the roots of the anger and frustration that's obviously out there.
Yeah.
That and reduce the availability of guns, which is another whole multiple
That's a
webinars.
whole other can.
Yeah.
And we can get into that in a moment. I just want to kind of respond to a couple of things that three of you mentioned. First is this public sphere in which violence and lack of empathy has been happening. I mean, this is not news of any kind. We've been seeing it for several years, where over time we've sort of seen a degradation of kind of that human-to-human connection and respect in public discourse, paired with just so much violence in the news, and then of course social media amplifying kind of the combination of all of that. I want to bring in a statistic because I think that there's something important to understand about it. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on a recent survey was done of about 1,000 voters, and they found that about 41% of young people, I think it was between the age of 22 and under 30, I think it was, found that the incident that happened with the murder of the CEO was actually acceptable. What do we think of this? Maybe Alan, you can kick us off.
Yeah, happy to. To state the obvious, that's shocking and incredibly revealing in a negative way about where some of the things we've just been talking about, the sentiment in the country of not being as anti-violent, opposed to violence and empathetic as I think we used to be as a U.S. society, and we've moved in a wrong direction there, and need to kind of as a society, and certainly corporations can play a role in that, and leaders, whether they be political or corporate, can help us all shift that dialogue to a healthier place. My own sense is that part of this, and where we are today, some of it's been through, leaders saying things that, go in an opposite direction of that. But also, I feel like we've also become, if you look at data about how constant, and I'm not trying to make any political statement here, by the way, but I think we're a very concentrated society in terms of wealth and control. That's just the way it is. The easy means, for example, in a given company, I don't like the way this company does X. I won't buy their product. I'll go over here. That's become tougher to do. And we've taken that outlet, the easy outlet, which is the normal capitalist way of doing things. I'll spend my money somewhere else. Harder to do because of the concentration and lack of availability of alternatives. I'm not making a statement about whether that's good or bad. I think it just is. And given that exists, I think that frustration level that we're seeing, combined with this kind of less resistance to violence, leads to this kind of result.
What do you have to say about that? Yeah, Savros, I was going to turn to you next. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, I just wanted to jump on two things that Alan mentioned. Obviously, we talked about social media already and the effects that this has had, but that effect also applies to corporations too. Like corporate actions are much more transparent in the social media age, and that allows for choices that are regular business choices to be recorded, to be manifested, to be discussed in ways that in the past that wouldn't have happened. So corporations themselves are subject to this type of scrutiny, which is kind of more intense and with higher pressure than it was before. So so that's one element, and the other element is kind of this drive for efficiency. Alan mentioned that it's been so much harder to make different choices as a consumer. But at the same time, as corporations have become larger, they're trying to maximize profits, cut costs. This is things that corporations should be doing, of course. Uh, but at the same time, these choices are becoming much more transparent, and people object to some of these choices more readily than they object to others. So this the higher drive to achieve that, combined with higher transparency over how you do it, creates a situation that could become sensitive if it goes out of hand. And that kind of level of higher scrutiny is what's happening. At the same time, you have investors and shareholders having very different preferences in terms of how companies behave. Some shareholders would have liked, in this case, the healthcare industry to be friendlier to consumers or more open to concerns. Others, not so much. So this division among shareholders and among investors is also reflected on the difficulties of the choices that companies are making. In other areas, in climate change, this is even more pronounced. There are people who'd like some companies to move, faster towards addressing climate change, and other investors who like this to be kind of more measured or are more concerned about the effects of transition. So these differences in views that shareholders have also create difficulties for businesses that need to make choices one way or another.
I would just, as I'm listening to you talk, Stavros, one of the things that keeps ringing in my head is this novel? What we saw happen in the news about a week or so ago, is this something that is unique to the time we're in today? Or have we seen, essentially consumer or stakeholder social reaction like this in the past? And I ask this question because there's so much to learn from history, but I wonder if we're at a crossroads where we kind of have to figure it out all on our own this time. Just an open-ended question for anyone to jump in on, really.
There are some elements, as the professor, I think I need to take the lead in answering about history. So there are some elements of this that are resurfacing and some elements that are novel. So the elements that are resurfacing is this mistrust of corporate power that has been around US public opinion for some time, like the Sherman Act is from the beginning of the 20th century. But in the past, this mistrust was mostly channeled either through a concern about, big concentration of companies and mergers that dominate the marketplace, or lobbying and corporate power to affect legislation and regulation. So these are kind of the traditional concerns about corporate power in America. What we see, the new element that we see with this action and the public reaction to it, is that this is not about, it's about neither of these, but it's about how the business runs itself. It's about the business choices of the company. And this is the new element, I think, that now we're scrutinizing that aspect, which was different than the ones that we're doing before. I don't know, Seth, as CLO.
I'm not sure I think it's that different because I think the reason for the anger and frustration is how the business actions affect the consumers. And I think the consumers have been angry about actions of companies for a very long time. You talked about a couple of legislative responses to that. But just to take to show how historically this can happen, before email, 40 years ago, for example, Levi's decided to pull its support for the Boy Scouts because of the refusal for the Boy Scouts to allow gay scoutmasters. And it's not a giant company, not a major policy issue, but this in the days before email, we got 120,000 letters, 98% of which were hate mail for people protesting the decision to pull our modest funding of the Boy Scouts. So people have felt strongly about these things for a very long time. More recently, what's interesting to me is I think a lot of folks lost faith in the government and in religious institutions after some of the scandals in the Catholic Church and some of the scandals in government, and began to have more faith in corporate leaders as truth tellers. And then they lost that with Occupy Wall Street. And so I think there's a lot of cyclical changes in how leaders are perceived in the United States. And there's certainly now a populist, anti-elitist feeling that's going on that ends up expressing itself in some things like this. And this act, which was so heinous, is really being treated almost as if it was graffiti being sprayed on the wall of the offices, as opposed to the death of a human being. So I think all these factors are making this a remarkable time. Sadly.
Yeah, I would just add, Seth, I agree with you. And I do think, this isn't necessarily new or different, but maybe all those things coming together to make it worse. And then without, getting into politics at all, it is also a time when political and government and the corporate world are maybe closer together than they've ever been. That I remember anyway. I mean, I don't say ever, but certainly that I remember. And you don't really, that when those two elements are linked the way they are, seemingly headed, and have been in the most recent presidential race and subsequent to it. Again, that makes just a lot less choice and a lot less counterbalancing available. So I just think that sense of frustration, I don't know that we've seen the end of it yet. And that worries me.
Let me just jump in and, kind of guide us a little bit in a different direction. So, this is in some ways not an unpredictable outcome, though it is shocking, given the erosion of trust we've been seeing in the past about 10 or so years of government, and slowly now the erosion of trust in business, and a commonly known thing now, and mostly 2024 at least, an erosion of trust in generally institutions. And anyone or anything that represents that, an institution or a traditional model, in some ways is seen as tied to the ills that institutions have failed to address. The reason why I bring this up is my question is around a lot of the anger that I think folks are displaying in social media and the news and any of those things. It stems from a desire for someone to address a systemic problem of inequality and polarization. It's very clear from how, unfortunately, this murder was conceived and designed, but also what we've been seeing in terms of social movements for the past several years. It is clear that for better or worse, people are looking for answers. And in a world in which government was a place where folks could get answers, given its gridlock, given its inability to deliver, folks have turned attention to the business world. And now, as problems continue to get worse and businesses, individual actors who do not control entire systems but have at least some proximity to it are now in the spotlight. And it sounds as though that folks are willing to go the lengths to get these answers and solutions. For many, it's a matter of life or death. For folks in the healthcare system, for folks who are victims of gun violence and all of those things. These are political topics that have been associated with the current incident, but underlying all of this is a larger conversation around inequality. So my question is, we're in a very complicated world, and a large part of our audience are folks who are practicing law in-house or at firms, companies, corporate leaders, students who are one day going to probably go into business law of any kind. Uh, what should companies focus on and not focus on, considering kind of this incident, but also this underlying baggage that is there? And maybe Seth, you can kick us off here.
Sure. So I think that there are a couple of things that come out of this that I would say that companies can focus on, and then there's maybe a separate set of what general counsels and lawyers who support companies can focus on. But from the company perspective, the obvious opportunity for CEOs is to really we've talked a lot about how every action that they take now is so heavily scrutinized, but to be really thoughtful about how they can be principled, how they can be human and humble, and how CEOs can be mindful of all stakeholders. I mean, I think, as Stavros said earlier, there's certainly an obligation of a corporation to be successful and to be profitable in order to continue and to grow. And then there's a lot of debate, but certainly some people feel that there's also an obligation to society. And to the extent that a company does agree with that, and I think many companies now do, it's an opportunity to show it not just in here's how much we contribute to good causes, but really to drawing the connections between what the company does and how the society benefits and how the society operates. From a more sort of tactical perspective, I do think this calls attention to a lot of security issues that companies need to start thinking about and should have already been thinking about. I don't think they should overreact, but I do think they have to start taking it seriously. And at some point, Anjali, when you think it's appropriate, I can go into that a little bit.
Yeah, and we should. But I see a question in the Q&A, and that was the one I was going to ask anyway. But before we even get into how to solve this problem, at least how to do business in this environment, my question is, do we think this will happen again? And I hate asking this question because it's just so ominous and scary, but I think it's an important one. Like, who and which industry should be concerned? How do we make sense of the future here? What's happening? Is this a moment, or is this
Yeah.
going to happen more?
I can just answer a little bit about the industries that I think are most at risk. This is a form of workplace violence. Workplace violence has been with us, sadly, for a while. And I do think that there are some industries right now where the frustration is very focused, to state the obvious, healthcare and insurance, in part because the decisions that are made affect consumers and affect loved ones so directly. And there is, as anyone who has had to struggle with seriously ill relatives knows, there's no frustration like the frustration of not being able to take care of a loved one who's hospitalized or worse. So they are at risk for violence, particularly those people who have the task of saying you're not covered for this, or there is nothing we can do to make the pain of this person's experiencing go away. But there are also, unfortunately, other industries that I think are ripe for violence right now. Academia always is, partly because strong opinions are often expressed in academia, but mostly because they're open campuses. A lot of corporations and other institutions have security built in, so you can't just walk into the buildings. Not so much true in academic institutions, and sadly, of course, as we've seen in schools throughout the country, and that is one of the most tragic things going on. And last, I'd say technology. There are very strong technology and media. So there are very strong opinions right now about what's going on in technology. People are very afraid of what AI means, correctly or incorrectly. And they are, I think, feeling powerless and very worried. There's a great sense of anxiety out there. And I think people do uh, very, very dangerous things sometimes when they feel that they're directly threatened. So social media, technology companies, and mainstream media too, which obviously carry strong points of view on their pages, are all places where they need to be thinking about preventing the next attack.
Yeah, I would add to that, Seth, in thinking about industries where people's lives are meet or can be meaningfully impacted. The other one, or an other one that comes to mind, and it's a pretty broad one, is the financial sector. If you think about, I mean, maybe at its most extreme, crypto, where people are maybe somebody decides to put all their money in Bitcoin or something, and then I don't know what will happen with Bitcoin. It goes up, it goes down. They lose their money one way or the other. Maybe it was a bad decision. Nobody's forcing anybody to invest in anything, but who you now have no money and you look for somebody to blame. That's the kind of situation where, a bank or a financial institution of some type gets blamed, and they are painted with one brush as they're just bad banks, and that's just, it does mean for the banks and the financial institutions just to keep it in mind as they, in some ways, it's just all of these players in these industries, because of the nature of their business, need to be mindful of, I would say, almost being truthful about themselves, in the sense that a lot of times they don't get to show their right side, because it's not like part of their normal parlance, but that doesn't mean it's not there. And I think, there are under such scrutiny. They have to take advantage of that a little bit to make clear what they are doing on the positive side, and the value they're adding to society generally. It's hard though.
I agree with Alan and Seth's list. The one industry that I would add would be fossil fuels, just because, in the age group that you mentioned before, Angeli, in the age group in which the murderer belonged, like 18 to 29, this climate change is a big concern. So I would probably add that industry into the list.
Yeah, I guess now we can turn to the tactical, Seth. Well, yeah, we're sitting here talking about how we should take precaution. Great. What does that mean? How does one take precaution of someone whose entire job is to be a public face? Um, and it's, I don't know. I don't even know how to begin thinking about it as someone who's often in a public face. I would be terrified to even put my face out there if this is kind of one of the industries you guys mentioned or anything like that. So, how do these conversations look in the C-suite at the board level? Bring us into maybe any examples you might have that you've had to kind of work through.
Sure. So it is always lurking in the back. And right now, there are audit committees that look at risk and boards that look at oversight of the company and risk that are getting briefed on both their own personal security and the security of the leaders of the company. So the main thing that I think that companies should be thinking about in terms of doing what's going to be actually useful and not overreacting is recognizing that this is an ongoing process, that they have to look at a number of things in terms of gathering ongoing threat assessment and intelligence. And there are online vulnerability analyses that security professionals do for CEOs. And you basically look at what's being said on the web, on the dark web, all over about the company and the CEO. And frankly, there's no difference in the minds of most people. So anything that the company does the CEO has to understand she or he will be held accountable for, hopefully in more peaceful means, but certainly potentially in a more violent means. So that means investing in security intelligence, investing in these kinds of analyses. And then there are a number of very simple things that many CEOs don't want to do, but need to do to protect themselves. For example, just by way of example, varying their routines. I mean, most of these attacks occur when people figure out a time and place that the CEO will be regularly. So many CEOs, for example, take a run every morning, same route all the time, or they go swimming, same place, same time every day. Admirable, perhaps from a fitness perspective, but very dangerous in terms of threat monitoring. There are also opportunities to bring greater security into one's online life. So sadly, posting pictures from having your teenage kids posting pictures from your vacation place, if you're a CEO, is a very dangerous thing to do. People now know you're in a vulnerable place and they know exactly where you are. So monitoring the online presence of both yourself and your family, but also ensuring that. So, for an example, a security person I know, just as to show me how significantly easy this is to do, took some online postings from a CEO about where they worked out, where one of their kids was in Boy Scouts, and where one of their kids was in soccer practice, and was able within, let's say, 3 minutes to say, this is where you will find her. And of course, when we Googled her address, it was right there. So it's just it's very easy to be found these days, and you have to be thoughtful about not putting yourself out there. And last, I would say is, and this is where the general counsel can really make a difference, merging the functions of the chief information security officer and the chief security officer to take a holistic view of what the risks being faced by the company and by the executives, and which executives to protect particularly, is an important ongoing thing. So the big point is, you don't just do something in response to this attack. You build in processes and systems that will enhance the overall security of the company.
Yeah, one thing I would add, Seth, which is really kind of where you started, less tactical, maybe at a broader level, is, what's the role of the board in all of that? And I think where you started was talking about having risk assessment that every board does. We all have some boards do it quarterly, have a portion of their board meeting. Some have a larger one. One of the big quarterly board meetings is looking at the various risks the company faces, competition, et cetera, environmental, all of those things. One thing that I don't think tends to be in there as a equal weighted sort of risk thing to look at is, what is the public's perception of us as a corporation, which also bleeds, as you said, into, because people identify the CEO with the company. It also therefore blends into the security of the company. But even before you get to the security of the individual and all that, is, how are people perceiving us? Not even necessarily what are we doing right or wrong for the moment, but given what we're doing, how do people look at it? Do they look at it as, are we looked at as a good corporate citizen, or are we looked at in a negative way, which therefore leads to all of the risks you described?
And that's kind of what I wanted to ask next. And it kind of also touches on one of the questions that one of the audience member has. But, I mentioned earlier, is this a moment, or will this become something bigger to think about? And what I actually want to ask is, do you think that this in some ways is a warning sign that might become ingrained in the ethos of corporate leaders as something to take seriously, as that society, or that people as a stakeholder group is an important part of business strategy and business decision making? And what you've referred to, Alan, around how it's not discussed enough, that public sentiment of the company, or of the leaders of the company matter in some way or form. Maybe Stavros and Alan, I mean, anyone really, what do you think about this? Do you think this is something that will get ingrained, or do you think we'll return to business as usual? What would it take for it to become ingrained as that stakeholders do matter? And here's a reason why.
So I think that some of the factors that we discussed in the beginning of our conversation about social media, populism, the drive for efficiency, shareholders with different preferences, all these are long-term changes that are going to stay with us for a while. They're not going to go away tomorrow. So I think companies are slowly reacting, and some companies faster than others are reacting to this reality. And Seth already mentioned that some companies are more mindful of the impact their choices have on society than others. But we certainly know ways in which companies can better track and understand their social impact and also respond to it and react to it and see if there are any choices that they can make. There are not Obviously, not every company face the same type of social risk, and that's going to be different for each company. And that's the discussion that Alan mentioned that the board should have. What are the specific social risks that we are facing based on our product? And then build a sense of governance processes, perhaps through the audit committee, but also through kind of the corporate bureaucracy to understand how certain decisions affect society and stakeholders more broadly. Some companies do consumer surveys, which are kind of, they've been around for a very long time, and that's a useful tool. But there are other companies, when they launch a specific product, for example, they talk to a set of experts, maybe from academia, maybe NGOs that understand better than the company and better than the CEO what is or the effects of company choices on the ground. So all these are voices that boards would only benefit from hearing because they would learn something about themselves that they don't necessarily know, they haven't necessarily heard in those particular terms. And the more companies follow these processes, the more likely they are to be able to predict, to prevent, well, not prevent, but at least be better placed against reactions such as this one.
Yeah, and I think related to that, Stavros, is a little bit was alluding to earlier, which is in addition to looking at those things and seeing whether behaviors should change or not, I can speak for, without naming companies, but companies I've worked with who I think do those things, but haven't really focused on making sure that people know about them as much as they know about their normal, margins and, all those things. They're already doing those things. So one of the things I think boards and companies need to focus on, because it really is important, is making sure people understand what in fact they are doing. If they're not doing them, that's one thing. But there are many corporations who are doing really good things, and they just don't give it the same degree of, I'll say publicity, that's not really the right word, but don't put it forward enough so that people do understand there's a lot of good going on as well.
I think that's right. And I do think there is also a lot of skepticism and cynicism about companies that talk about this. So it's become more challenging to talk about the good things you're doing without sounding like greenwashing or something like that. But it's important. I agree a lot. And in order to come up with effective ways to do that, I think one of the things that boards have to do is ensure that they're getting objective input. A lot of times I've seen boards make decisions or propose things that are based on something they heard at a dinner or at a party or at a conference, which is fine. But it isn't the same as having an objective source come to you and say, this is what people really think about what you're doing, the Edelman Trust Barometer, for example. This is what how companies are really seen. And you may not like it, but all these, I'm making this up, but all these good things you're doing, it's not winning over any hearts. And so you need to rethink where you're putting your resources or how you're talking about them to your point and to Stavros' earlier point.
That is very helpful. I think talking about the good things in a world in which um, folks are trained by the media cycle, social media to really elevate algorithms are designed to uplift sticky and often negative content. Couldn't agree with you more that it is a very, very tricky situation to be able to brand yourself a little bit better around the things that are working. Um, I'm mindful of the time. I'm going to ask one last question. There's so much more I want to talk about, unpack with you all, but an hour is not going to solve this problem. But we can at least try. So parting questions before we turn to the Q&A is, um, amidst the noise, and it sounds like there's just so much noise and never goes away and more noise gets added. Um, let's just say that this is the moment of pause we have today, this one right here where we're on this webinar. How can folks lead, especially CEOs, especially corporate leaders in the C-suite? What does leadership look like in a moment like this? It's a hard one.
I'll jump in just to get things started. I think, first of all, to the earlier point that I made about humility, acknowledging the anxiety that's going on societally and among employees. People are worried about a lot of things. And I don't think it's a bad thing to acknowledge that, even if you're about to talk about good news. And because a lot of times the good news actually backfires because people say, well, that's all fine for you, but I'm struggling here. So showing that empathy, acknowledging societal issues and employee anxiety is important for corporate leaders to do. Bob Haas came up with the phrase "profits through principles," which a very simple but important thing for companies to think about. Really taking the time with their boards to think about what their principles really are, what their values really are, and trying to not only live them, but to the earlier points that Stavros and Alan made about talking about them and why they're important and how the company is trying to live by them. I think if they do those two things, they'll get a little bit further along the way toward being a responsible company.
Yeah, I think, just super quickly, I think that combination of legitimate empathy, showing that that individual, the CEO in this case, the leader, and the people who level down as well. It's not just the CEO. As they go with CFOs, everyone who goes out and is out and about representing the company, not only has a level of empathy, but I've always felt like, as you think about CEOs you admire or that you felt were really solid people, is the degree to which they are seen as, and in fact are, because I think people do see through things, regular people. Act like a normal person. Just be a person. How many times do people say, wow, she's a real person, or he's a real guy? Real person, real people. Real people have empathy, and real people are then believable that they do have that empathy and do understand how other people are feeling. Because if it comes across as just reading a script, that's not going to work. And people will see through that. If you're, there's too many people, you're under too much scrutiny for people not to see through it. So I think as people pick leaders, I think they need to think about leaders that are also real people.
Absolutely.
I agree with everything that Alan and Seth said. What I wanted to add to the conversation is another element of kind of understanding that there is that the dissatisfaction with certain corporate practices goes deeper than mere rhetoric. So it's not only important that the CEO, acts like the social leader. So first off, what we're saying in so many words is that society is now treating CEOs as social leaders, and public trust is important, which is something that they haven't traditionally focused on, but it's important that they focus on. But also that their efforts are going to be seen and assessed, and their efforts throughout the system. So it's not only important to talk the talk, but also to walk the walk. So the company needs to have in place not just values that are there on some website, but a consistent process that tries to think through these values in their everyday practice. And also, I would say also have examples where they made difficult choices where they had to, sacrifice certain things in order to maintain their values. And that this is important for the company's trust and ultimately, beneficial for shareholders as well. So I think it's important for the transparency to go all the way down so that people can really see for themselves that the company is trying hard to to put in place to really operationalize the commitments that it makes at the value level.
Well, thank you for sharing your advice on how to kind of move forward from something like this. I did want to turn to some of the questions that are being asked by the audience. One that sticks out, and it kind of dovetails off of what's being discussed, is around ESG. And it's, seen its fair share of scrutiny, support, time in the headlines. Do you believe that if ESG principles were taken more seriously by corporations, treated less like marketing tools and more as transformational tools, do you think these kinds of situations, particularly this one, would have been avoided? And this is a very hard question. So
I mean,
not in your professional opinion, but even in just what you've seen, how would you respond to this?
so I would say that ESG has become part of the general concern around populism. It has managed to attract backlash, and it has become kind of an acronym in the cultural wars. So at this point, it's something that companies need to navigate through. Certainly, there was an element where every company would go out and make a statement about something and everything that's happening. And I think, without doubting the sentiment about that, I don't think that anybody was convinced about what this meant. So I think what companies are now realizing is that it's not just about rhetoric, but it's about how they behave in the real world, which is something that they should be focusing on. So I think that what Seth was saying with about kind of thinking about security and thinking about the public perception of the company, what Alan was saying about having the board think about the social risks as a different element. This is not far from ESG, but not exactly what ESG, the way we understood it like 5 years ago, really meant. And I think these are the real processes that are going to help companies move forward.
I'm just going to move quickly so we can cover ground here. Another question is, do you think that the difference in pay between executives and other employees plays a role here?
I certainly do. It is there are two questions really. There's the actual difference, and then there's the perception of the difference. The perception of the difference is going to be always a source of concern and anger in a society like ours, and people are while they could even understand the formulae that lead to the high pay of a CEO, they still think that stepping back, there's something really wrong with somebody making 5,000 times what the average employee makes, or 1,000 times, or even 50 times. So I think it certainly fuels the populist anger of what's going on. The solution to that is a little trickier, because unless everybody agrees to start playing by different rules, there will be high bidders for the services of great CEOs.
Yeah. Next question. And this is a little bit of building on what Alan had said before, so maybe Alan, you can take this. But do you think that this incident will shift the kind of leaders and qualities folks look for in CEOs when they're hiring? Do you think we're going to see a change in hiring practices around kind of corporate leaders?
Yeah, I don't know if this event actually does that because, and I don't know, I've never met uh, the former United Healthcare CEO, but I don't know that there's anything particularly, about him that attracted this as anything he did or said, except he operated in a highly sensitive, charged industry. So I don't know that it will do that, other than some of the broader topics we talked about, which which really we're talking about as a result of that. But I don't think, oh, that event means we have to do any of these things. So I think it's part of a broader discussion that we've been having about how boards and companies should think about themselves in the broader environment in which they operate.
Next question is, and I'm kind of summarizing from everything I'm reading in the Q&A here, but there's some emphasis around the young people that have reacted so differently than different parts of the US population, around the acceptability of taking kind of the law into your own hands and vigilante status. Do you think that there is something to be said about the challenges young people are facing, whether that's growing up with gun violence and active shooter drills at school, whether that's video game culture or social media culture, or a number of kind of leaders that they see displayed on a day-to-day basis who normalize violence or speak of violence? Um, is there some empathy to be granted to folks who are feeling that perhaps this is the only route to take, which is to respond to violence or perceived violence with violence? I
So,
know this is such a difficult question. Thank you, each of you, for helping us unpack it. But yes, any thoughts you might have?
so as someone who's about to face a semester with 150 young people in the audience, what I found that works is just being reasoned and justified, and being able to hear their concerns as well, and understand where they're coming from. There's always a level of anxiety that people of a certain generation tend to underestimate against young people because, we've been through that phase of life. But their anxiety is very, very real. And that's where it all begins. Now, at the same time, what we can do best is explain in very clear terms about why we follow the practices that we do, the solutions that we do, and also being able to hear from them what they have to say and what they have to suggest. It's that would be my take as a teacher, and that's my reaction out of trying to work with them. They're really fun.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, we only have a minute left, so I'm not going to ask the others to chime in at all. It's a big question, and I could not agree with you more, Stavros, as someone who is also roaming around campus quite often. I think all of us actually are at Berkeley Law often. It is a tricky time to be a young person. It is a tricky time to be a leader of an institution. It's a tricky time to be teaching. It is just a tricky time, and I would posit that more dialogue than less is probably the solution at a very baseline. And so with that, I just want to say so much of my gratitude to each of you for talking about this with us, unpacking it and engaging in dialogue, and to our audience members who have so kindly shared with us their thoughts as well. I will hopefully see all of us again in January, but if not, Happy holidays to those who celebrate, and we will see you in 2025. Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.